My name is Megan Feeblecorn, and I am the new Associate Director of Awake. I am very pleased to introduce myself to this audience and to welcome you to the second presentation in our fifth season of Awake's Courageous Conversation series. Today, we are honored to bring together two guests who help faith communities respond to abuse for a conversation that we've titled A Gospel Response to Trauma. Awake is a growing grassroots Catholic nonprofit organization, and our courageous conversations are part of our mission to awaken our community to the full reality of sexual abuse in the Catholic Church, to work for transformation, and to foster healing for all who have been wounded. I'd like to introduce you to my colleagues at Awake who work to bring these conversations to you. This team includes today's moderator, Erin O'Donnell, along with Wendy Mitch, who greeted you upon arrival, Tim Ellinger, Mary Gentile, Teresa Bolster, and Christian Crocus. Another important member of our team, Catherine Hours, cannot be with us today as she is expecting the birth of her first child any day now. Thank you for making the choice to join us today. Our audience is from all over the United States, with a few people joining us from other countries. This gathering includes abuse survivors, their loved ones, and many lay ministers, clergy, and victim assistance coordinators who want to better understand the act of listening well to people who have been wounded in the church. I want to extend a special welcome to those of you who have experienced sexual abuse in the Catholic Church, as children or adults. I am sorry for the ways you have been harmed, and I am honored that you are here today. Whether you have remained Catholic or have taken a different spiritual path, please know that you are welcome and valued here. Please take care of yourself in whatever ways you need to during this event. If anything in the conversation is too painful or triggering, feel free to log off or to take a break and reach out to someone who can offer you support. We also have a list of simple grounding techniques that you might find helpful, which we are going to put in the chat box now. A few logistical announcements before we begin. First, thank you to everyone who has introduced themselves in the box. At this point, we are going to turn off the group chat feature so we can all remain focused on the presentation. And we also ask that you turn off your video at this time and change your Zoom setting to speaker view. Our panelists will respond to some audience questions later in the program. If you have a question that you would like them to address, please send it to our team member, Mary Gentile, during the panel discussion. Again, her name is Mary Gentile, and you'll see that she has the word questions by her name in the chat box. You can send questions by selecting her name from the drop-down box at the bottom of the chat screen. Today's event will be recorded and shared on Awake's YouTube channel, but we are recording in speaker mode, so your name, video, and chat comments will be kept private. Now I would like to introduce today's topic and our speakers. As I mentioned at the start, today we consider the topic of trauma and the wounds, large and small, that each of us carry. We are all blessed and broken, and our faith communities benefit when we make an effort to understand trauma and envision the ways we are called to respond to one another. Our two guests will help us explore what trauma is and consider how gospel teaching demands a thoughtful, active, courageous response, and gives us a good model of how to respond. I am honored to welcome these two speakers. Pete Singer is the Executive Director of GRACE, or Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment, which helps Christian churches and organizations recognize, prevent, and respond to abuse. He has a master's degree in social work and is an experienced mental health professional who speaks nationally on trauma, trauma-informed practice, resilience, and the role of faith communities in responding to child maltreatment. He's written a lot on the topic of trauma in faith communities, including an important recent article, Toward a More Trauma-Informed Church, Equipping Faith Communities to Prevent and Respond to Abuse. He and his wife, Chris, live outside St. Paul, Minnesota, and have 3 adult children and 3 grandchildren. We are honored to have you with us, Pete. Paul Fahey is currently a limited licensed professional counselor, a retreat leader, and the host of the Third Space podcast. He provides counseling for those who have been spiritually abused and creates resources for church leaders to better safeguard their communities against all forms of abuse. He previously worked for 8 years as the director of religious education at a Catholic parish. Paul lives near Lansing, Michigan with his wife Christina and their 5 children. Thanks for being here, Paul. Each time we close our courageous conversations, we express a desire to cultivate love, hope, and healing that leaves no one out and no one behind as we build this beloved community. I expect that today's conversation will give us many ideas for doing that. So let's begin our conversation. I'll turn now to Erin, who will serve as our moderator.
Thanks, Megan. Thanks very much. And welcome, everyone. It's really good to be together, especially with these terrific speakers. Pete, let's have you start us off. How do you define trauma? Let's see if we can unmute you. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Apologies.
Oh, no problem. No problem. I think it's really important when we talk about trauma that we understand what we're talking about, because people may mean different things when they say trauma. A lot of times when we think about trauma, our focus is primarily on the event that occurred. So it might be an assault or an accident or some other type of significant event that's occurred. SAMHSA is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and they help us understand that trauma goes beyond that. The trauma is indeed, part of trauma is indeed the event that has occurred, but beyond the event, it's the way that that event is experienced and the ongoing effects of that event, something that they call the 3 E's of trauma. And I'll give you a story from my own life that kind of conceptualizes this, because one of the things that I think that this definition of trauma does is it gives us hope. Because very often when we find out that somebody has had trauma in their lives, that trauma may have already occurred. There are definitely things that the church and that people can do to prevent trauma, and there's a responsibility to prevent trauma when that's possible. But often when we first learn of trauma in a person's life, it's an event that has already occurred. But this whole more holistic view of trauma, that it includes the experience of the event and the ongoing effects of the event, gives rise to hope, because I cannot change an event that has already happened. However, I can enter into the experience of the event, and I can enter into the ongoing effects of the event. And so there's more hope in this understanding of trauma, because there's more places that we can step in and make a difference. So the story from my life that helps me understand these 3 E's is related to the fact that I have cancer. And when I was diagnosed with cancer previously, one of the things that my church did was the church leaders all came over to our house and prayed over my wife and me. Now, at that point, they were not able to change the fact that I had cancer. So the event had occurred and they couldn't change that event. But they stepped into Chris's and my experience of it. And they stepped into it by having the leaders of the church come over and pray over Chris and me. And then the pastor of our church said, would you mind if on Sunday you and Chris came forward and we just took some time to pray for you and your family? And on Sunday, they took that time, they prayed over my wife and me. And then after that time of prayer, the pastor said, you know what? We're just going to ditch the sermon for today. And we're going to take the entire time to pray over you and your family. And they did. They took the entire time to pray over my family and me. And then after that time of prayer, a close friend of ours from the church came up to us and said, I know this is going to sound weird, but can I do your laundry? And for the next year, every Saturday, we put our dirty clothes out on the porch, and every Sunday, they were returned clean and folded. Not once did I ever hear anyone from our church say to me, Pete, you're 310 pounds. What did you expect? Pete, you have a relatively sedentary lifestyle. What did you expect? Pete, you have a diet high in sugar and fat. What did you expect? And because of that, I got to experience this event not blamed. So I experienced the event surrounded by this great community, not only this great community, but this great community that represented Christ. And I got to experience this event not blamed. It didn't stop there. After a while, I hadn't been able to work for about 4 months, which for some odd reason has an adverse impact on your revenue. And my wife and I were sitting down, we were doing our finances, and we came to the realization that we didn't have enough money to make our house payment. And we faced the very real possibility that in the middle of cancer, we were going to lose our house. And it was right as we were having that conversation that somebody came to the door, and it was Rod from church. And he says to me, we were thinking about you today, and we thought maybe you could use a little bit of help. And he hands me an ice cream bucket. And I looked down at the ice cream bucket, and the ice cream bucket was full of cash and checks. And that ice cream bucket made our house payment, and we did not lose our house in the middle of cancer. And in so doing, every step along the way, the church entered into our experience of this event and the ongoing effects of this event. And that is something that we as the church, I think, are incredibly gifted to do, incredibly equipped to do through the power of the Holy Spirit, through Christ working in us and impacting other people. One of the problems is, though, that sometimes we exercise that power that we have, that ability that we have, when the event is something like cancer, when the event is a natural disaster. But we forget what we're called to do. We forget what we're equipped to do when that event is abuse. And we need to, as the church, remember our calling, remember what we've been equipped to do when we reach into trauma that has occurred in a person's life, including the trauma of abuse.
Thank you, Pete. That was a really beautiful illustration of how that works. And thank you for sharing that piece of your personal story. Really meaningful to hear about the 3 E's and that they are a source of hope. You know, at Awake, we're always looking for sources of hope. So, Paul, I'd like to turn to you next and ask if maybe can you make a case for why it's important for people who work in parishes and other Catholic organizations to understand trauma, to do what they can to educate themselves about trauma? I think we're still having that problem.
Excellent. Can you hear me, Erin?
Yes, great. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to take a couple of different approaches to this question. The first one is practical. SAMHSA, the government organization that Pete mentioned just a minute ago, estimates that around 70% of individuals experience at least one traumatic event in their life. To conceptualize that, right? That's 7 out of 10 people sitting in the pews with you in church. If you're on parish staff, that's 7 out of the 10 people on your parish leadership board. That's 7 out of 10 priests in your diocese. That's 7 out of 10 religious sisters in your community. Now, obviously, that's not always the case, right? This is a average of a lot of people. But the fact is that the majority of people have experienced at least one traumatic event in their life. And that needs to shape, I think, how we perceive people and how we respond to people. The question is specifically about why Catholic parishes or Catholic organizations need to educate themselves about trauma. I think that there's very much a gospel mandate and a mandate from the church itself, to be educated about trauma, because we have a mandate to care for, prioritize and learn from survivors of trauma. So to draw from some of the church's own social teaching, the church has very strong teaching about the infinite dignity of every single human person, a dignity that cannot be lost because of actions that person does or actions done to that person. Nothing reduces every person's infinite dignity. The church is also clear that human beings are the only creatures that God willed for itself. So this means, and the way the church articulates this, is that economies, governments, organizations, churches, parishes, the church itself exists to serve the dignity of the human person, because it's the human person that's the end and can never be means to some greater end, because there is no greater end. So when we're thinking about respecting, I guess here's the juxtaposition that comes to mind. We have in our teaching this, what the church calls this preferential option for the poor, which the church defines as more broad than those economically or materially poor, but it includes everyone who's vulnerable, marginalized, sick, or oppressed by the powerful, and that we must give them preference both in our care and in the voices that we prioritize and learn from. But often, instead of giving a preferential option for the vulnerable and marginalized and those oppressed by the powerful, we often give I heard this on Gloria Purvis's podcast 2 or 3 years ago, a preferential option for the institution. And that would be putting the needs of an organization or even the church's institutions above the infinite dignity of every person. So I think we must educate ourselves about trauma because we have a mandate to prioritize care for and listening and learning from survivors. But this is also difficult. Actually listening to, believing, and learning from survivors is often very challenging for Catholics. I think of like my psychological background, my counseling background, and in the school of counseling that I come from, there's the principle that psychological pain comes from the experience of incongruence between who I wish I was, my ideal self, and who I actually am in reality. And the experience of this incongruence is painful. So I avoid this incongruence with these psychological defense mechanisms, often in denial or avoidance, in order to not experience that psychological pain. But for me as a Catholic, as someone who's worked in the church for many years, who's been a Catholic my whole life, who's studied theology, where like my identity is wrapped up in the Catholic Church, for me to listen to and believe and learn from survivors is to enter into a space of real incongruence and realize that what I thought the church was, and these leaders were, maybe isn't the case. Maybe there's actually systemic abuse happening in the church, and that's a part of the reality I need to contend with. And maybe I need to confront the fact that I've participated in these abusive systems as well in my own work in the church. So actually listening to and believing and learning from survivors is to enter into a space of, it can be a space of that feels like betrayal, like the church has betrayed me or I've betrayed myself, actually. And that can lead to real existential crises about my own faith life, my belief in the church, my belief in God. And that's why often when survivors come forward, they're met with, even with very well-meaning people, defense mechanisms, avoidance, blame, because people are not willing or ready to enter into that space of incongruence and actually confront reality and listen and learn from survivors.
Excellent. Thank you so much for articulating that that incongruence. That's a very interesting thing, how we make sense of those painful realities. And Pete, I just wanted to give you an option here if you wanted to chime in, if you had anything you wanted to add there.
I think everything that Paul said is just so so true. It's an area that we don't like looking at. It's so much easier to look at a problem that is out there, that is not so close to, as you described, core to our identity. And this is something, when we're talking about abuse in the church, abuse in the Catholic Church, we're talking about something that's, in essence, that's part of my group. It's part of my people. This is not something out there. This is something that is so close, and that just as Paul describes, makes it so much more painful, so much easier to say, I don't want to look.
Mm, right. Right. So let's talk some specifics. And Pete, maybe we can have you get started with what a trauma-aware or a healing-focused church, what does it look like? And what are the characteristics that you look for?
So we're going to go 3 for 3, and we'll have the third straight question where we reference SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. SAMHSA, I think, they issued back in 2014 this document about their concept of trauma and trauma-informed practices or trauma-aware practices. It's not an extensively large document. It's around 20 pages or so. There's a 300 some odd page document if you'd ever like to check out a 300 some odd page document, but there's a 20-page document, which is so much easier to digest and to get through. But in this document, they describe these 6 principles. And I don't believe that they were trying to do this, but what they accidentally did was they created a document that is very scriptural. They created a document that, if you go through it, is based on scripture. And so these 6 principles that they talk about, and these 6 principles are key as we're trying to intervene, as we're trying to prevent events from happening in the first place, as we're trying to enter into the experience of the event or enter into the effects of the event. These 6 key principles are paramount. The first one is safety. And safety isn't just talking about physical safety, but it's talking about emotional safety. It's talking about psychological safety. It's talking about spiritual safety. So often abuse can cause an incredible spiritual harm. And as a person works through and responds to that, a lot of times they're working through this intense spiritual harm that they've experienced. I can think of one kid, he was 12, that came to see me after having experienced significant abuse himself. And he says to me, I don't think God will like me when I die. I have too many questions about what happened. And that child at 12 has an intense spiritual wound, a sense of not being safe spiritually. And so to help be able to provide this environment of safety in every respect must be paramount. Also, trustworthiness and transparency. And the idea behind trustworthiness is simply to act in a way that is worthy of trust. Not as a tool to get people to trust you, but simply because as followers of Christ, that's what we're called to be. We are called to be trustworthy. We're not called to lies and cover-ups and deception. We are called to bring to light that which has been in darkness, to be this trustworthy beacon. The third principle is peer support. And that looks at making sure that a person's or a community's needs are being met, but it also really listens to and prioritizes the voice of those with shared experience, the voice of those who have been through it. And so we need to be listening to a person who has experienced abuse and be listening to their wisdom and their insights, and allowing them as much as this person would like to be playing a role in how the church responds to abuse more broadly as well as in specific situations to the degree that they want. The fourth principle is collaboration and mutuality. This idea that we aren't in this alone and we can't do this all by ourselves. There has to be collaboration. There has to be working together between the person providing help or the person doing an action and people who have experienced abuse. There has to be collaboration within our own group as well. So it might be one church leader collaborating with multiple other church leaders to try and do well in this area. It can't be one individual. It has to be collaborating with others. And it goes even beyond collaborating with others in our own group. It extends to collaborating also with others outside of our group. And that would be perhaps a faith leader collaborating with a mental health provider or a doctor or whatever it might be. So that need for collaboration at these three different levels: collaboration with the person who has been abused and harmed, collaboration within our own group, and collaboration with those outside of our group. The fifth principle is empowerment, voice, and choice. We recognize that trauma by its very nature strips power away from a person and silences a voice. And it's our job to walk alongside that person as they take some of that power back, as they find their voice. And this is really rooted in our understanding of power. Jesus said, "All power is given to me." All power is God's. All power is Christ's. Any power that we hold, we are only holding as a steward, as somebody who has the ability to exercise that power for the king, because it's the king's power. And so how we use power, as we want to look to how Jesus used power, and Jesus used power to lift up the oppressed. Jesus used power to give voice to those who were voiceless, and we must use power in that same way. And then finally, the sixth principle is humility in the face of historical, cultural, and gender factors that are simply inseparable from the trauma that has occurred. And we have to have humility. We need to listen, and we need to pay attention to those historical, cultural, and gender variables.
Great, thank you. It's a very comprehensive list, and I just want to acknowledge also the peer support piece. That's a very central part to Awake's mission, providing sort of survivor support, peer support for those who would like to take part. So I just want to ask you, thank you, Pete. I want to ask you, Paul, if you have anything that you'd like to add at this point. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Pete, thank you for that, and thank you for the article you've written that spells all of that out. I was familiar with those principles from SAMHSA, and I love the way that you brought in both scripture and concrete examples of how Christian communities can respond to this.
Thank you.
As I was reading through your article a few weeks ago in preparation for this conversation, like my thought process was, yeah, and there's a church teaching for that, and there's a church teaching for that. And like I was thinking as a catechist of, yeah, the church not only affirms and all of these things, but I would say that all of these things are mandated in some way by the church's teaching. And I won't go through all of them, but the synod that just finished in Rome is on my mind. I just read the final synod document, and this is the church making an effort to try and understand how to provide healthier leadership and ministry in the church. And it explicitly calls for church leaders and really all the baptized at every level to have more transparency, have more accountability, have more collaborative decision-making, prioritizing the vulnerable and the marginalized, listening to survivors, listening to those who have been oppressed by the powerful. These are explicitly called for by the Synod delegates, approved by the Pope 3 weeks ago. So not only are these principles not foreign to the Catholic tradition, they're actually encouraged and mandated by the church's teacher.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Paul. I am I'm really valuing this conversation, but I just wanted to insert myself here, Pete. We had an audience question, audience member who asked if you could just repeat quickly what those 3 E's are that we began at the beginning with. And could you
Sure.
remind us what those are?
Absolutely. So the first is the event, so the thing that happens. And then it's the experience of the event. And then the third is the effects of the event.
Great. So that's event, experience, and effects.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, great. Thank you so much. So it's very important to us at Awake to center survivor voices. And this is a good moment, I think, for us to reflect on some experiences that survivors in our community have shared with us. I'm going to read a few of them that we're sharing with the permission of survivors. I'll read one at a time, and then I'd like to ask you, Pete and Paul, to comment on how those events were handled and what a healing focused approach might look like. So let's start with the first one here. The survivor says, when I was 10 years old, I was abused by a visiting priest at a rectory in my neighborhood. Later, at age 64, I suddenly started having flashbacks of that abuse. It was like seeing those scenes on a continuous loop for 15 months. It was terrible and confusing, and I felt desperate. I visited 10 different priests asking for help. Most were not nice or helpful. Only one priest said, "I'm so sorry that happened to you." And so, Pete, let's start with you. What do you hear in that story?
I hear one priest being responsive in a way that actually can open the door to healing. A lot is going to depend what that priest does after that. But I hear of one priest who made an initial right first step. I hear priests who maybe weren't nice, some of them because they were choosing to not be nice, because they weren't honoring the person. And I hear probably some priests that were also just not aware and not clueless, because we don't adequately train our priests and our leaders to respond well. And we need to do a better job of that. And even if somebody didn't intend to be mean, somebody didn't intend to blow the person off, their actions caused that person to be harmed more, to be hurt more. And as the people of God, we're called to do exactly the opposite. We're called to be a source of healing, not a source of harm. And the response, unfortunately, that this person received caused more harm. And so I see opportunities for healing that were missed. And we need to take those opportunities when we're presented with them. In part, we do that by better training our leaders who may be hearing such stories.
Thank you. Thanks. Paul, I wonder if you have things that you'd like to add. One area that this story raises for me is what a leader might do to receive a disclosure. If someone comes to you and explains this is what they've experienced, how might we receive a disclosure in a healing way?
Yeah, some really practical things. It's essential. It's so essential to listen, to actively listen, to demonstrate to the person that you have their full attention, to listen with empathy, to listen with non-judgment of any kind, and to clearly communicate in words and in body language that that person is valued and respected. It's extremely important to not get defensive. And I don't want to understate how difficult this can be, especially if the person who's disclosing, who's sharing their story of trauma with you, it may be someone you know, it may be someone you admire, it may be a brother priest in your diocese, for example. It may the person may be expressing a lot of blame and anger towards the church, or to even God Himself. So if you feel defensive, it's okay to feel defensive, like name that for yourself, but do not get defensive with the person who you're listening to. Um, I would also discourage offering prayer or scripture as a response unless it's explicitly asked for. Um, often, survivors of trauma in the church have experienced scripture and prayer used in a manipulative way. Same with talking about forgiveness and reconciliation. That may be an important step. It's not the step for now. And that must be done in such a personal and individualized and delicate way. It's better not to bring it up, in my opinion. It's important to validate the harm that someone is expressing, that is actually really harmful for them. And doing this can start the healing process for that person even before they see a mental health professional. But it's also important to know the boundaries of whatever your scope is, of what your capacities are, and to have mental health professionals you can recommend someone to if that's something that they want.
Yeah, Paul, that's terrific. It sort of points back, Pete, to what you were saying before about the collaboration piece.
Right. That working together. And we need to do that because there's just so much that has occurred. And some of those statistics, for example, that Paul was sharing, the 70% of people, there's no way that a person can do that alone. And so we have to do the collaboration. I think Paul made a very good point as well about some things that are important and that may be part of the person's journey. As things progress, we don't need to get all that in right now. We don't need to get from A to complete healing the first time a person tells us about the things that they've experienced. And so part of it is patience and waiting and just being still. And like you said, Paul, listening.
It's beautiful. Thank you. Let's move on to a new story from a member of our community. Okay, she writes, I met with my pastor and disclosed that I was abused by a man who composed liturgical music. My pastor was incredibly kind and agreed that he would immediately stop all use of my abuser's works in parish liturgies. 6 weeks later, I walked into Mass and my abuser's music was programmed as the preparatory hymn. I was so upset that I left the church and had a panic attack in the parking lot. I reached out to Father to ask what happened, but I never got a response. It's been radio silence for over a year now. I no longer feel safe to attend that parish. And so I would ask you both, Paul and Pete, what are your thoughts about this person's experience?
I think that it's a heartbreaking experience, but unfortunately is not an uncommon experience. I think one of the things that we need to remember and that this really highlights is that responding well does not involve what we do now and then we can forget about the situation. Responding well is a long-term response. And again, it highlights the importance of some of those principles. For example, when Father said he would not have that music playing anymore, and then 6 weeks later, it was playing. that was a breach of trustworthiness. And then when there was no response, there was a breach in trustworthiness. And so it highlights again the importance of all those ways that we can interact with a person who's experienced an event like this. And it highlights the importance of this isn't a short-term response, but it's a long-term response.
Thank you. Yeah, Paul, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah. One thought that comes to mind, like if this was someone I was working with professionally, one of the things I'd want to respond with is to validate that their decision to no longer attend that parish because it doesn't feel safe. It's because it's not safe, because the pastor has demonstrated that they are not trustworthy and that they are not prioritizing the needs of survivors. And like to validate that discernment and that that boundary that was set up. I'm not going to put myself in an unsafe space like this. Yeah. Speaking more broadly, to go back to that point, we must have a preferential option for survivors of trauma. And that doesn't mean just listening, as Pete said. It means in the decisions and all the decisions that we make. And a survivor discloses to us this thing that's unessential to the community, to the liturgy, is deeply harmful to me. There's absolutely no reason to not listen to that survivor and to make that small change. Yeah. I mean, it makes me feel angry hearing this story, if I'm being entirely transparent.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Let's move on to an experience that has a different flavor. It's a little bit more of a positive experience from the perspective of the person who experienced abuse. So the survivor writes, "My parish holds a Pinwheels for Prevention event each year, which focuses on preserving the dignity and safety for all children. We plant more than 500 pinwheels on the front lawn of the parish grounds. It is a dramatic visual display of support for safeguarding efforts, and it's really awesome to see the more than 500 pinwheels spinning in the wind." So let's talk a little bit about what's good about this scenario. Pete, maybe you should go first.
Sure. There's a lot good about this scenario. It's a positive expression of the issue. A lot of times it can feel like when we're trying to address issues such as abuse, it seems like we're constantly talking about bad things, which is because abuse is bad. And this is a way to get people to think about it with hope, that we're putting these pinwheels out here because we actually think we can make a difference, because we actually believe that progress can be made, that we can make abuse less common. So I think that that's incredibly important. And there are so many other ways that we can do that. And it might be, Pinwheels for Prevention. In April, there's Blue Sunday, which is a Sunday set aside to remember children who've been abused. And in October, there's Children's Sabbath, which is a Sabbath that's set aside to honor children. And so there are many opportunities that we have throughout the year to honor children and remember those who've been abused, those who have gone through such an incredibly painful experience. But beyond that, there's also even just additional ways. And it makes me think that maybe at this church, if it's deeper than just a surface action, but if it's actually truly caring about the issue, truly caring about people, that maybe it can be mentioned occasionally in sermons. And it doesn't mean that we have to have an entire 15, 30 minutes, 45 minutes devoted to the topic. Sometimes that actually is a good idea, in my opinion, but it might be, our message today is about forgiveness, and we're just going to take 5 minutes to talk about what forgiveness looks like in a case of abuse. The message today is about whatever other truth it may be. And you just take some time to say, you know what? There's a lot of nuance, and it makes it a little bit confusing when abuse is entered into the picture. And to acknowledge that and address that regularly, whether it's from the pulpit, in a Sunday school class, in a Bible study, but just as well as this beautiful idea of the pinwheels, raising awareness and bringing our focus and attention there. There are so many other opportunities for that to just take advantage of those.
Yeah, thank you. And I was in the examples you were naming, I wonder, obviously in the Awake community, we're very aware that, people who have experienced abuse, it's not just children, of course, that it's adults as well. And I wonder if there exists any day to remember people harmed in that way at that point of life. It just makes me wonder if there is an existing month. But of course, we're talking about making these a regular part of the church life. Paul, is there anything that you'd like to add?
Yeah, this story, like an image that's resonated with a lot of survivors of abuse in the church, who I've talked with and worked with, is the experience of like the story of the emperor with no clothes, where they feel like they're standing there and they're looking around at this church, and they're seeing the defensiveness, the systemic abuse. They're seeing like the ugly underbelly, a part of this, and looking around at their community, and it's as if the community either doesn't see it or doesn't want to see it. And it's an experience that's been described as like gaslighting, as even just going and participating in the community feels like you're kind of going along with that make believe that things really aren't that bad. So this story, well, probably not sufficient, is a real step at acknowledging, no, look, like a part of the truth and reality of the church is the harm that's experienced by people. I think more efforts like this, a lot of the things that Pete described as well, are important. Even just to validate to the survivors who see this harm, that yeah, you're not crazy. You're seeing things as they are, and to help bring other people on board, to be like, yeah, this is actually what's true, and that's a really difficult truth. But we have to engage with what's true because that's what we're called to as followers of Christ. Yeah, that's what comes to mind hearing this story.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you. I just want to take a moment to remind the members of our audience that Paul and Pete will respond to audience questions. So if you have a question that's percolating while you're listening to them today, please go ahead and send your questions to Mary in the chat. We'll be getting to those in a moment. But next, I'd like to just sort of acknowledge, we've heard from a lot of survivors in the Awake community that there are some elements of the Mass that can be difficult for them. So this ranges from seeing a priest in vestments to hearing prayers for the local bishop as part of the Mass, the smell of incense, maybe a particular reading that the person associates with their abuse. Even, stepping foot in a church building itself can be really painful. So while it may not be possible for Catholics to change those elements of the liturgy, I want to ask you, Pete and Paul, how can we be more sensitive to those triggers and support survivors who might be impacted by them? And maybe, Paul, just to mix it up a little bit, Paul, we'll have you go first.
Yeah. Yeah, what comes to mind on even a most basic level is each of us as members of the body of Christ need to stop judging people if they're no longer attending Mass or not receiving communion or not participating in community events that they used to participate in. In the Catholic world, like I hear and years ago participated in like really negative comments, like someone's a cafeteria Catholic or someone's a fallen away Catholic. There was a stat about 6, 8 years ago in the United Kingdom from Dr. Lisa Oakley, who's done a lot of research on spiritual abuse. So this is specifically spiritual abuse, not sexual abuse in the church. But she surveyed thousands of Christians in the UK, and I believe it was 75% reported experiences of coercion and manipulation. These are Christians in their community. And that's shifted my thinking in such a profound way of like when someone's not participating in the way that they were, someone's not attending mass and they used to, of approaching that in my own mind. And if I have a relationship with them, in my relationship with them with compassion and curiosity, instead of judgment, instead of these negative condemnations of they're not as faithful as they used to be. Because there's a whole number of reasons that I don't know and that I don't necessarily have a right to know about why someone isn't participating the way that they're participating. So on an individual level, we can all do that. From people in positions of leadership, I mean, I think there's things that we can look at. I think the Diocese of St. Paul, Minnesota has set up a ministry where they have survivors bringing communion to other survivors who sign up, who don't feel safe or comfortable attending mass. I think more initiatives like that are really important. Honestly, I think even doing catechesis, like if you're a priest or a catechist in your parish, like telling people that trauma and mental health are legitimate reasons to not attend mass. There's so many Catholics who think that if I'm not in a hospital bed or snowed in with 3 feet of snow, that I have to make it to mass, and that I've done something wrong if I don't. So I think gentle teachings about that to ease people's conscience and empower them to be able to engage with the Lord even outside of the liturgy, if that's not something they're able to do.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Pete, what else would you add?
I think, Paul, you highlighted just the creativity that is often required. We just need to think outside the box sometimes. I think it would be so easy to assume that things can't be done, and so then we don't even try. But the examples you gave, Paul, are people trying and people finding some solutions. So I think to try to not assume that it can't be done, to take a hard look at what is necessary and what is just the way it's always been done. Because some of the time, the way that things have always been done isn't necessary, and it is okay to change it up. It is okay to do it differently. And just as you highlighted as well, the importance to listen and not judge. We're so often not going to know why a person stops coming. We're so often not going to know what's bothering a person unless we ask or unless we listen. And so just the importance of that listening in figuring out how we can respond, how we may be able to adjust things.
Thank you. Thanks. So I'm wondering, if Catholics or parish leaders, parish employees who are in the audience today and are listening, who are wondering how best to educate themselves about trauma. What resources do you recommend as sort of places where folks can learn more about trauma? And Pete, maybe let's start with you.
Sure. I think one place to start is the Bible. The Bible talks an awful lot about trauma. The Bible talks about sexual assault. The Bible talks about Hophni and Phinehas, the sons of Eli, who were called worthless men. And they were called worthless men because they were using their position of spiritual authority to have sex with people. So Scripture doesn't shy away from these issues. Scripture addresses them. And so one place to look is Scripture. There are many great authors out there. As Paul mentioned, Dr. Lisa Oakley, she's amazing. She and Justin Humphreys have written a book called Escaping the Maze of Spiritual Abuse, and that's a great resource that's out there. Other authors such as Diane Langberg, who's written Redeeming Power and a number of other resources. Wade Mullen, who's written Something's Not Right, as well as other resources. If people wanted, they could go to the Grace website, netgrace.org, and there's Learn More tab at the top of the page, and then on the drop down that comes, one of the buttons you can click is Resources. And so click on that and you'll find hundreds of resources addressing just various aspects of abuse in general, and specifically faith-related abuse that has occurred within the church. One of the things that Grace does is we do a monthly webinar on an abuse-related topic, and how that abuse intersects with our faith, abuse across the lifespan, multiple types of abuse. And you can find those on our YouTube channel. So just going on to YouTube and searching for Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment, that'll get you, that'll bring up our YouTube page, and you can go there. And that's right now, there's, I think, right around 40 or 50 of them that are available for free to listen to. And they're hour-long webinars that people can view and listen to. And so those are just a few of the resources that are out there.
Excellent. And for anyone who is frantically taking notes and worried that maybe they missed some things, we'll go ahead and put the titles and so on in the Awake blog next week on Tuesday. So fear not if you've had trouble keeping up. We will be sharing those resources. Paul, what would you recommend?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first and most important thing is to listen to the stories of trauma survivors. Awake is a fantastic resource for that. Reading through the blog and the many stories that survivors have shared. There's past courageous conversations of survivors sharing their experiences. I think that's the first place where we need to learn. There's many excellent podcasts, some Catholic, some Christian, that share stories. There's a podcast series that came out a few years ago called Deliver Us, about the abuse crisis in the church. There's a podcast called Resilience in the Shadows that highlights stories of survivors specifically. There's just so many resources. And then once you start looking, you're going to keep finding more. So that would be the first place, is listen and really listen and seek to learn from the stories of survivors. As far as like educational texts, a really excellent book, and it's like 400 pages. Don't let the size discourage you. But Dr. Judith Herman has a book, Trauma in Recovery, that really lays out. It's not from a Christian perspective, but it will give you a really solid grounding on what trauma is and how it impacts people. Yeah, that would be an excellent resource as well.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. So we are beginning to receive audience questions, and I wanted to just go ahead and turn to a few that we've received. The first question is, let's see here, for those who work in the church. When I'm creating a list of mental health providers to refer my parishioners to, how do I find providers or counselors who are good specifically at treating trauma? So what would you advise?
I think one thing to remember, and it's very important, is that not every therapist is a good trauma therapist. Not every therapist is a good therapist, but definitely not every good therapist is a good trauma therapist. So one of the things that's going to be really important is ask questions. Don't assume just because they have the title of therapist that they're the expert. So ask questions. Trauma should be something that they specialize in, not just something that they occasionally work with. Almost any therapist occasionally works with trauma. It should be something that they specialize in. And ask questions. Ask them if they specialize in it. Ask them what they know about trauma-informed practice. Ask them what they know about trauma in general. Ask them to describe how they use power in their therapy sessions. Ask them to describe all these things. And in some cases, what you're looking for is you're looking for specifics of an answer. And in some cases, what you're looking for is just, are they able to give an answer? Because that indicates that they've thought about the issue and that they have some insight into these questions that you're asking. I know the American Psychological Association has a resource that they've put out on finding a trauma therapist. And you can find that in the list of resources at Grace, or you can find it by doing a search for how to find a trauma therapist. And that can be a good resource as well. I think one of the keys is to do it ahead of time. Do your research ahead of time. Don't wait until it's a need.
Right. Okay. And so maybe a person who works for a parish or in a Catholic organization would have sort of a list of names ready to go. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, great. And Paul, I just wanted to give you a chance if you have anything that you'd like to add.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, all that Pete said. I know amongst Catholics, there's a hesitancy to see counselors who aren't Catholic. And I myself I'm a counselor who's Catholic. I believe it's better to have an ethical counselor than a Catholic counselor. It's better to have a competent trauma therapist than it is to have a Catholic counselor. So don't let your questions, your vetting, your stop at whether or not they're Catholic. And if they are Catholic, I think there's specific vetting that would need to be done. Specifically, if someone is a survivor of abuse in the church and they see a Catholic counselor, I would want to know before I recommend to that person that that counselor who's Catholic isn't going to get defensive of the church in their work with that person. So if they're a Catholic counselor, there would be even more vetting that I would do. Which isn't to say don't see a Catholic counselor if you have someone who's very sensitive and trauma informed and specializes in trauma, who's Catholic. They may be able to integrate spirituality in a way that a non-Catholic counselor couldn't, and that can be really positive. But yeah, those are the things that I'm looking for when I'm recommending clients to counselors.
Excellent. That's really helpful, helpful tips. Thank you. Another question that we received, I'm going to go ahead and read it. We talk about qualities that indicate someone is responding to a survivor in a trauma-informed way. For a survivor looking to approach someone to talk for the first time about their abuse, what characteristics about others might indicate that the person would receive well? In other words, how do we choose a person to talk to? Yeah, go ahead, Pete. Sorry.
I think one of the things you're looking for is generally, how does the person carry themselves? If it's a person who tends to throw their weight around, if it's a person who in other matters is not a very good listener, then they might also not be a good listener in this area. One of the things that a lot of survivors have told me that they do when trying to choose whether or not to tell a person is they release small amounts of the story and see how the person responds to that. And if the person responds well, then okay, I'll tell more, but they're going to have to earn it. They're going to have to earn my trust. They can't just naturally expect my trust to be there. They have to demonstrate some trustworthiness. And so choosing a person that in other situations has shown that they are a good listener, and then gradually releasing information are just a couple of tactics, strategies that I know some people have told me they use.
Excellent.
Yeah, I would just to add to that, to trust your gut. If you have something telling you this isn't a person who's trustworthy, don't feel like you need to justify that to yourself. Trust your gut.
Yeah.
I think also I can remember one of the times that I was going through cancer, pretty much everyone was telling me the spiritual benefits, and that it wasn't really what I needed at that point. I didn't need another person telling me the spiritual benefits of cancer. I'd heard that message a few times already. And then I had this old friend that I hadn't spoken to much for years, and she reached out to me and she shared with me, and she started sharing the footprints story, walking along the beach, and then she ended it. And remember, when the person turned to Jesus and said, "Why is there only one set of footprints in the stand?" Jesus turned to me and said, "Because the sand people always walk single file to hide their numbers." So it's also being able to find somebody who doesn't overly spiritualize everything. Because yes, there is a spiritual component. There's a spiritual wound, but there are other pieces of this as well. And they need to be able to have that balance of, yes, there's a spiritual side, but we're not going to over spiritualize everything. We're not going to insist on a false positive or a spiritual redemptive narrative that may not be genuine.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. I'm going to be chuckling about the sand people for a while. Okay, so we have a question about the impact of abuse on communities. The audience member writes, the experience and effects of abuse of individuals in the church ripple up and through families and communities. Are there ways you can suggest to promote collective healing for communities harmed by abuse? It's a big question, but I wonder, do you have any thoughts about sort of this community piece?
The first thing that comes to mind is truth telling as a community and transparency. But yeah, telling the truth and telling the truth publicly and receiving whatever consequences need to be received from telling the truth. The truth is really important.
Excellent, thank you. And
I think
Pete,
lament. I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, please.
Publicly lamenting and together. This is a community experience of, as a community, we express grief. As a community, we confess what we've done wrong. So a lot of the things that can be done on an individual level can be done at a community level. That expression of grief and lament can be so profound and so powerful. And I mean, scripture is filled with examples of laments. And I think a lot of times we've lost that as the church today, that lament is actually part of our faith. And we can do things like lament.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, and I would ask also another question. We have from an audience member who asks, is it effective to have survivors directly address a religious congregation? And then they ask, if so, how can that be arranged in a safe and healthy way for the person who's experienced abuse?
I think it varies. So one thing would be the person who's addressing the congregation needs to be somebody who wants to address the congregation, not somebody who's forced into it or pushed into it or pressured into it, but somebody who truly does want to do that. I think it's important to work with that person, not to just impose some set boundaries, but to figure out with that person collaboratively. So what are the boundaries going to be on this conversation as far as the level of detail, the amount of time, that type of thing. I think depending on what the person says that they need. So a lot of it's going to depend on what the person says they need, not what you as whatever your position might be thinks they might need, but what they say that they need. They may need a support person with them, and that's okay. They may need somebody available with them, and that's okay. But a lot of it's going to rest on what they say they need as a person. And then the leader just needs to listen. It may also be helpful to, depending on the situation, possibly prepare the church for a potentially difficult story that's coming their way, or to determine what to do with kids during that time and whatnot. It may be appropriate for the kids to be in. It may not be appropriate for the kids to be in, depending on the nature of the conversation.
Mm. Yeah, that's helpful. Paul, do you have any ideas on this front?
No, I don't have anything to add to that. That was a really great response.
Yeah, thank you, Pete, and thanks, Paul. We have a more specific question that I want to get to. We do have time for this. Let's see here. So we've already discussed liturgy. We asked that question about, elements of the liturgy that can be painful or triggering. Would either of you like to help liturgists to be trauma sensitive? Are there any tips or ideas you could add? We're pretty defined in the Catholic Church by things like scripture readings through the lectionary. And I wonder if there are any ways that we can invite trauma sensitivity into into aspects of the Mass that a person may not have the authority to change.
Yeah, the thoughts that come to my mind are, as you expressed, there's a lot that cannot be changed, but there's a lot that can, and I think those are the areas to focus on. So the music, the liturgical music, was one that came up earlier. The parish has a lot of autonomy over that, and so at the minimum, not playing music by composers who've been credibly accused of abuse, at the minimum. But also, like, if survivors in the community express concerns about some of the music, take that seriously. The other area, which doesn't fall to liturgists but falls to priests and deacons, is the homily, which obviously they have a lot of autonomy over. And there's so much to say about that. There's almost too much to say about that. But having that trauma sensitivity in the homily is also very important. I suspect that that the homily, more than other places in the Mass, is the place where survivors of abuse in the church experience the most harm, is coming from the homily. Obviously not universally, but I suspect that that's the case most of the time.
Hmm. Yeah, Pete, do you have any thoughts on that question?
No, I just really echo all that Paul said, and yeah, the wisdom of it. And we need to think and not just do things blindly.
Excellent. We need to think and not just do things blindly. Words to live by. Okay, so I'd like to go ahead and ask one final question from the audience. And it has to do with something that you've touched on, Paul, about the spiritual aspects of abuse. What does a spiritual approach add to healing? What is missing if that piece is left out? What can a spiritual approach not do? So we've sort of talked about that a little bit already, but I wonder, what are the pros and cons of that spiritual piece?
Yeah. The first thing I think of when I hear that question is that it's extremely important to not collapse the psychological into the spiritual. Trauma causes real psychological harm that requires psychological care. Treating trauma, over spiritualizing trauma, can either lead to inadequate care or spiritual bypassing, or some of the things that Pete's described earlier of, like, yeah, so God's going to do great things in this, and there's a lot of harm that can happen in that space. At best, it can lead to that. At worst, it can lead to the inadequate care can lead to much graver harm. So not collapsing the psychological into the spiritual. I think integrating spirituality into healing from trauma that happened in the church is a really sensitive and individualized thing. Um, Dr. Langberg, who's mentioned before, she says, and I agree with her, that any abuse that happens from a spiritual leader is also spiritual abuse. So that means that the spiritual and religious places and rituals and prayers and people and songs that were once supportive can now become places of harm, can become triggers of past traumatic experiences. And I don't know that unless I'm extremely attentive to the person I'm working with, unless they are a part of this process of integrating spirituality into their healing. So making assumptions that, oh, this spiritual thing, this prayer, this liturgy, this song, this whatever is going to be helpful for them, I would warn against that very strongly. This has to be very individualized to the person who's experienced abuse in the church.
Excellent. And Pete, would you like to have the last word on that question?
Sure. I think Paul highlighted the importance of addressing both the spiritual and psychological needs of a person. Like Paul said, they are not the same. They are different. We can't collapse one into the other. And we recognize that we need to address them both. I mean, just consider some of the questions that come to mind as you think about the faith-related abuse and whether you've experienced it directly or whether you know somebody who's experienced it. Those are some deep and profound questions that come. I mean, not just, I mean, you know, an example, that the kid that I mentioned, he was 12 and he's thinking, God won't like me when I die because I have too many questions about what happened. There's no way that that can be addressed only as a spiritual question or only as a psychological question. It's both, and they both have to be integrated and collaborate and trying to care for a person. And so, yeah, the collaboration, cooperation, and not trying to collapse the one into the other.
Terrific. You've given us so much to think about today. That last question is so meaty that we could probably do another whole courageous conversation on that topic. So, but thank you for all of this good food for thought. So let us end the conversation here. I want to extend deep thanks to Paul Fahey and Pete Singer for their wisdom. And then go ahead and pass the mic off to Tim Ellinger, my colleague at Awake, who will take it from here. Thank you. Okay, who is having trouble getting online? Sorry about that, Tim.
There we go. I think, can you hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Timothy Ellinger, and I'm one of the volunteers that work with this wonderful team to pull together and make these courageous conversations happen through Awake. And again, they would not happen without the wonderful participation of the people in the audience and our tremendous, powerful, wise speakers like we've had today. We'll be coming back to the speakers in just a moment to ask them for sort of one last final thought. The intention of courageous conversations is to sort of catalyze and inspire personal action. And to do that, we have a number of different things that are going on. Some of the announcements that I want to make about that, first of all, is that the next Courageous Conversation, which will be a wonderful sort of follow-up to this, on power in the church. And that conversation is going to be taking place January 23rd at noon Central Time. Watch for details that will be coming out about that. I think it'll be a really great opportunity to pick up on some of these things that were talked about by our panelists today. The second announcement that I have is that next month, we're asked you to join, if you would like, the Awake community for the Advent prayer service. which is a special event that is entitled Encountering Advent Through Survivor's Art. Promises to be a very special and powerful event. We'll gather on Zoom on Tuesday, December 17th. That's Tuesday, December 17th at 7 p.m. East Central, 8 p.m. Eastern Time. You can get more information and sign up at the Awake website. Lastly, please watch for the feedback survey that should be coming out to you later today which includes registration for part 2 of this courageous conversation, the small group format that we have to follow up on all of the information that was discussed here today. Please note, typically we have this the week after. Because Thanksgiving is next week, we are going to be holding part 2, the small group conversation, 2 weeks from today on Thursday, December 5th at 7 p.m. Central, 8 p.m. Eastern, again in that small group format. So look for that and please sign up for 2 weeks from now. And also, when the link comes up for the recording, please share that with your networks. A lot of information today that can be extremely valuable for many people. So with that, I want to come back to our panelists and ask them sort of what's a take-home message from today, advice, things to think about for us to sort of go forth from today's, for those of us in the church that are striving to create healing, a trauma-aware community. So Paul, would you like to go first?
Yeah. Thank you, Tim. Yeah, the thought that comes to mind is that being a more trauma-aware Catholic, being a more trauma-aware Christian is not extraneous to our mission as church, but is an integral and central part of what it means to be a Christian, the church's work in the world. Yeah, this isn't an extra thing. Like I mentioned several times, this preferential option for the vulnerable, for the marginalized, not just in our care for them, but as a place of privilege where we listen and we learn. And I believe where the Spirit is working in a profound way. So this is not an extra thing. This is integral to our work as church.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think about a phrase I hear sometimes that it's not sprinkles on the donut. It's essential to what we are as community. Pete, if you'd like to sign in.
Now I want a donut. I think it's really important. We're all on a journey, including a journey of healing for many of us. And so in that process, have compassion on yourself, self-compassion. We don't get there overnight, but things take time. So have compassion on yourself. I think also, as Paul said, that this is central to our faith. It's central to who we are. It's not some checklist that we mark off. Okay, we went to an hour and a half long webinar. We went to Courageous Conversations. I can mark that off. This is central to our identity. This is who we are. This is central to the gospel, to the words of Christ. I mean, Jesus stood up and read from the scroll, and it described people who were marginalized and oppressed and beaten down. And he then rolled up the scroll and he says, today, this scripture is fulfilled in your presence. That's not a tangential sideways piece, but as Paul said, it's central. And then I think that it's also reasonable as we go about this work and as we seek to have churches that do a better job to expect accountability. And that's accountability for actions of harm, and that's accountability for not getting it right as well. I mean, there can be learning, there can be growth, but there can also be accountability.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both so much. And on a personal level, as a person who's experienced abuse as a teenager, I really want to thank you for the hope you've given to the church and the work you do, the way you talked about it today, the way, the 3 E's, really great examples of all of that. And I'm inspired. The Catholic Church has a tradition of every 25 years, we have this Jubilee Year of Hope. 2025 is the Jubilee Year of Hope, and we are all asked to be pilgrims of hope. And I think you gave us some good things to walk with as we go into 2025 in helping the church heal. So as we close today, the leadership of Awake is motivated by our faith to do this work. When we gather, we like to pray together. We like to call upon the Spirit in our lives. And we'll end our event with a short prayer. We also invite those to which prayer may be something that resonates with them in a negative way because of the abuse they've suffered. We know there are good reasons. So please, if you would like to leave, this is a good chance for you to step aside and know that we wish you peace, that we wish you goodness. We wish you the beauty of this wonderful season that's coming up. And we hope to see you again soon in our other events. As we begin our closing prayer, let us remind us that we, as always, we're in the presence of our God who is our mother, our father, our brother, our sister, our friend, our family. And feeling that presence now, we collect ourselves, knowing and listening for that love. We are that love. Thank you, loving God, for bringing us together this afternoon and giving us this sacred gift. Be together to witness, to listen, to hear this wisdom of our speakers. May we hold each other as we go forward in our hearts, that each of us can do our part to cultivate love, cultivate hope, cultivate healing that leaves no one out, that brings everyone in, that becomes the essence of who we are as your people here on earth, the full dignity of being human. And by walking together, may we continue to build this beloved community here on earth. Amen. Thank you all for joining us today. Go in peace.